Good morning, and I'd like to thank the university for this forum. My understanding is that this law school is dedicated to the union of law and social justice, and I think that is a marvelous and it's a necessary project, and I congratulate you on your mission. As we know, if you detach law from social justice, you have created an abomination. And it is a heartwarming thing to find a law school that's dedicated to keeping social justice and law tied together. The difficulty, of course, is what you've just seen from Professor Pogge. Professor Pogge is a professor of philosophy, and he's just shown you what it might mean to do social justice in the modern world. He has elaborated for you an extremely complex scheme for how to make public health in the world better, how to improve the health of persons throughout the world by creating new incentives for the pharmacological industry. But in order actually to achieve social justice, one has to have a very complex understanding of the administrative law of health. That's what you just saw in the presentation of Professor Pogge. So all of you law students who want to do social justice have to study very hard things like administrative law and contract law and markets and the way they work in order to bring social justice into reality. One can't imagine social justice as this shining abstract thing that's detached from the details of the administrative state. That's what I hope you've just taken away from the presentation. And it takes a great deal of insight and philosophical sophistication of the kind that you just saw from Professor Pogge in order to know how to join law to social justice. I will speak only for a few moments this morning, and what I will speak about is what is law. What do we mean by law when we join law to social justice? And I think that question is one that's appropriate for a law school, and it's one that I suspect people take, law students take, lawyers take pretty much for granted. So if you look at the scheme that Professor Pogge just put on the table, I'm sure you have studied enough law to know that there will be thousands and thousands of administrative details that someone will have to decide. Someone will have to decide which drugs to select. Someone will have to decide the implementation mechanisms for creating incentives for pharmacological companies. Someone will have to create the administrative agencies to implement the scheme. And who will that somebody be? Who will make the necessary decisions? Based on what directives? Based upon what values? The persons who, the bureaucrats who, will implement the scheme that Professor Pogge just talked about will be making law. And the question I want to explore with you for a second is, what sort of law will they be creating, and why will that law be legitimate? What will give that law legitimacy? And I propose when we start to think about the question of what makes law legitimate, we look first at the forms of law we understand best, which are national forms of law. And international forms of law pose very complicated questions, which we'll get to in a few seconds. But let's just take law in Chile, for example. I was out walking by your Supreme Court, and I saw a statue, and it was, I think it was Montt was at the top of the statue, and beneath was a woman who represented law. You know the statue. Law is very typically represented by a woman because sweet and beautiful, and it's lovely to be governed by law as distinct from the war of all against all. But if you remember what this woman was holding, she was holding a symbol of the law, and the symbol in Chile of the law was what? It was the code. Right? When you think about law, you think the code. That's what law is in Chile. That's different in different countries. In the United States, the woman would probably be holding the Constitution. That's our image of law. But here, you think the code. So my question for you is, if the code, if the Chilean code is the emblem of your law, is that any code, or is it the Chilean code? Suppose she had been holding the Argentinian code, or the Spanish code, or the French code. Would that be an image of law to you? Or does it have to be your own code that makes her, this woman at the base of the statute, an image of law? And I'm guessing that when all of you look at this plaque which says the code, you're all thinking the Chilean code. And you're thinking that's law because we, the Chilean nation, the Chilean people, made that law. That's why it's law, because we made it, and the way in which we choose to govern ourselves through law, through rules, through norms, is we create the norms that govern us. We create the code. If she had been holding an image, say, of, I don't know if Peru has a code, but say the Peruvian code, that would be an emblem of colonialism, right? It would be an emblem of imperialism, somebody else's law imposed upon you. That's not legitimate law. It's not legitimate law if the United States creates a law and says we're going to apply it to Chile. That's oppression. That's not law. So I take from that example the point that for law to have the legitimacy that is peculiar to law, that is special and the property of law itself, it must be at some level and in some institutional way connected to processes of self-government. You, the Chilean people, create the law for yourselves. And if somebody else, somebody outside created the law for you, that would not have the legitimacy of law, and that is not a vehicle through which social justice could be pursued in Chile, much less the international regime. So now that poses a question. Exactly what are the institutions through which you create law? Every society has different institutions. Every society joins democracy, self-governance, to law creation in different sorts of ways. And the ways in which what might work for Chile is different than what might work in the United States, is different than what might work in Great Britain. But that there must be some institutions that create a feedback loop between law creation and self-governance, that's a necessity. That's a necessity so long as you don't have colonialism or imperialism. So let's take that point as a given, and now let's go back to Professor Pogge's idea. Professor Pogge is offering to create an international agency that will govern the creation and distribution of medicines throughout the world. Is this an example of law, or is this an example of imperialism or colonialism? How would you distinguish between these two possibilities? If we've analyzed the case of the Chilean code correctly, it must be the case that Chile, or the United States, or any other country that would be governed by the health agency that Professor Pogge is offering to create, must have some voice, some authorship in the creation of that agency. Now, typically in international law regimes, this voice is created through the treaty process. You sign a treaty, you sign on to the Declaration of Human Rights. That is the most typical way in which international law is responsive to the voice of countries. But of course, a treaty is a one-time affair. And as the terms of the treaty get elaborated, as they get more concrete, thicker, more detailed, more administrative in the way that the scheme that Professor Pogge has proposed to you, the excellent scheme, would be thick and elaborate, the fiction of consent through a treaty looks less and less plausible because it has to do more work. It has to legitimate the endless numbers of administrative decrees that would actually make this scheme of international health work and take it away from the imposition from some international organization and make it law in Chile. So I take it that alongside of the form of innovation, of the form of reform that Professor Pogge is proposing, we would have to have reform in the creation of international law. we would have to create international bodies of governance in which Chile could participate and which would create for Chileans the sense that they are participating in the creation of international law. Now, we don't have very much of a sense of what those would look like. We have a sense at the national level. At the national level, what we say in the grossest, most abstract form is the nation participates in the creation of its own law because the citizens of the nation participate in the formation of national public opinion. And the state is responsive to public opinion. A state that is unresponsive to public opinion is not generally viewed as democratic. And so alongside of the notion of ownership of the law is the notion of freedom of speech, freedom in the participation of public opinion formation, and the notion of a public sphere within which people can participate and to which the government can be responsive in its creation of law. That's generally a precondition for the emergence of legitimate law in most countries in the world. We face a number of difficulties doing that at the international level. One is there is at the present no international public sphere.